Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And this guy just can't get enough of me because he's back once again. And say hello and welcome to Sywawish Riemann from Muqqadimah. It's always a pleasure to have you here, mate. And this week, I believe before we go to that, last time we discussed the medieval Islam, where it began from the rise of Islam until the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate. But this week, we are going to discuss something that I found the really fascinating, and that is the caliphate itself. That where the and what is the caliphate and how the caliphate worked, and caliphate meant generally what was the caliphate. And before I say caliphate too many times, let's begin with what fascinates you about this topic, specifically the caliphate in general terms.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for having me. And it's nice to be back. The caliphate, of course, began after the death of the prophet. While the prophet was alive, he was the secular and spiritual leader of the Muslim community. But then he passed away, and now there was a crisis of leadership. Who's going to lead this community? There's not going to be any more prophets, so who's going to lead the community? And the answer to that was Caliph or Khalifa,
Then
which literally means deputy or successor. You were saying
they
something?
needed the next best thing, basically.
Yeah. And so this sort of an idea of a caliph was born, somebody who's going to lead the community. The word imam was also used. Imam means leader. And so there was this sort of a general idea of what the office of the caliph is going to be. However, over time, by the time we get to first we go through the first four caliphs, right? Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, and then we come to the Umayyad Caliphate. And
Yeah.
during the early Umayyad Caliphate, from 661 to 692, the office of the caliph was certainly more a mediator position rather than an emperor in the way that we think of one.
And
The
if I may do that comparison, the early Romans didn't really know what an imperator were or
mhm.
emperor, if you really use the modern term. It was kind of like just a fancy title. So it was kind of the same with the title of Khalifa as well, right?
Yeah. The caliph's main role at the time was basically to keep everybody happy and just mediate their problems rather than trying to impose his will. So he collected the taxes and he just left everybody alone, especially in the early Umayyad period, from 661 to 692. And then we have, in 692, we have the arrival of Abdul Malik, who starts the Marwanid dynasty of the Umayyad Caliphate. And he sort of starts to shift the caliphate from, like I said, a mediator position and somewhat secular position to somewhat religious position. The caliphs before Abdul Malik had not really tried to impose themselves as the religious authority. So there was already a vacuum for things that the Prophet had not discussed. The Muslim community had problems that the Prophet had not discussed in his lifetime. So there was a question, okay, how are we going to resolve these problems? And for that, in the Rashidun Caliphate, because there were a lot of companions of the Prophet still alive, there was a sort of what you would call a council of companions who could uh, argue about these things and who could come to decisions on how we're going to handle certain things. And that converted slowly to the ulama council, which existed in many Islamic empires, and it still does in many Islamic countries, which is basically just a council of scholars who understand the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet. And during the Umayyad Caliphate, early Umayyad Caliphate, that was certainly the case. And then we come to Abdul Malik, and Abdul Malik starts a project of nation building. He tries to impose his Arab identity on his elites. He turns the Arabic language into the national language, and he starts to have these public displays of Islam's sort of dominance over Christians and Jews. both of these faiths that Islam saw as precursors to itself. One of the biggest symbols, of course, of this was the building of the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount, which was literally meant to sort of show a physical dominance. Like it's. I mean, today it's the most famous landmark of Jerusalem, an icon of Jerusalem. But even back in the day, you could see it from quite a bit of distance. You could see it sort of looming large over the great city, and so there was this sort of idea that Islam was taking over. And in the middle of all that, Abdul Malik was also trying to impose religious authority over the Muslims. One of the
What was the
biggest,
idea? Kind of a papacy for Islam in a way?
in some ways, yes. In some ways, certainly that was the case. Abdul Malik also tried to, well, not tried, he succeeded in sort of codifying the Quran. Now, generally, Islamic tradition tells us that it was Uthman, the third caliph, who uh, turned the Quran from a loose sort of book into a compiled book around 650 or so. But there are these days modern scholars do think that Abdul Malik probably played a big role in that as well when he compiled the Quran, when he had his general al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf compiled the Quran. So that was certainly an attempt from him to impose his authority over religion, over Islam itself. And that's when we start to see the caliph as a religious figure rather than just a secular figure. But then that attempt dies down as Abdul Malik himself passes away, and so subsequent caliphs were not very interested in imposing the position of the caliph. Rather, they were in imposing the position of the caliph as a religious leader. Rather, they just wanted to be secular leaders, because trying to impose yourself as sort of the leader of a religion is quite a lot of work, right?
Yeah.
If you're trying to impose yourself as a secular leader, you're trying to you're competing with the Byzantine Empire, you're competing with all these local lords as well, and on top of that, you're trying to build a religious image. Most caliphs were not necessarily interested in that. And so the Umayyad Caliphate turns into the Abbasid Caliphate. They fall, and the Abbasids come around in 750.
Before we go into the Abbasids, and I'm sorry for interrupting you, but I want to talk about the meaning of being a caliph. I know you'll be going to talk a little bit about this, but I wanted right now to just talk a little bit about what it actually means to be a caliph and what gets you the title of caliph, because I think most people's basic understanding is that you need Mecca and Medina, of course, and we will talk about this later as well, of course, that that's not necessarily the case when we have three different caliphs. But what in the early years, what did it mean? I mean, it kind of discussed this, that it was kind of the title of an emperor or,
Yeah.
next to God, but what did it actually mean to be a caliph of the Islamic world?
Yeah. So I was coming to that because I have to talk a little bit about Al-Ma'mun as a caliph first, because of how he tried to impose his authority, and then we can talk about that. So the Abbasid Caliphate comes around, and the Abbasid caliphs are not very interested in imposing religious authority either, until we get to a caliph named Al-Ma'mun, who was the
They are
son
more
of
science
Harun
nerds, the Abbasids.
Yeah, but Al-Mamun is also very much interested in imposing his religious authority. So I mentioned the term imam. The term imam is very much a religiously charged term. When the Prophet passed away, there was this dispute as to who is going to lead the community. There were those who believed that Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, would be, being the head of his household, would be the next leader, not only secular but also religious leader. And these people eventually became the Shias. And then we have others who believed that Abu Bakr would become the first caliph, as he was the most senior companion, and that this position is going to be a more secular position, that Abu Bakr is going to lead the empire through secular problems, not necessarily spiritual ones. But on the other side, the proto-Shias believed that the Imam's responsibility was also to lead lead the community in a spiritual way. So we also have this situation that just happens, or rather is designed that way, where the first four caliphs are all not only Muslims and only senior companions. Of course, they would be Muslim, but they were also senior companions of the Prophet. But they're also from the Quraysh tribe of Mecca. Even though they are the center of Islam's political power at this point is Medina, these companions are all from Mecca. They're all from the Prophet's tribe. So it sort of creates this general idea, general sort of unspoken rule that you have to be from the Quraysh in order to claim the Caliphate. And on the other side, there are Shias who believe that you have to be from the Prophet's family in order to claim the Caliphate, or to claim the Imamate. And among the Shias, there are also people who basically the thing among the Shias become that you have to be a descendant of the Prophet through Ali in order to become an Imam, in order to be leader of the Muslim community. Then we come to Al-Ma'mun, who sort of dwindles from this a little bit. He wants the religious authority that the Imam has according to the Shias. He wants the secular authority that the Imam has according to the Sunnis and the Shias. But he also wants to be connected to the Prophet because he is a descendant of the Prophet's uncle. So he's certainly from the Prophet's family, but he's not a descendant. So his sort of argument is that you have to be from the Prophet's family in order to be the Caliph, not necessarily a descendant of the Prophet. But he argued for the same spiritual powers that all the Imams had, according to the Shias, that he believed that he was entitled to those. When it comes to claiming the Caliphate, this is sort of the general criteria, but these criteria then get changed as well. So early on, there's the criteria that you have to be from a descendant of from the Quraysh tribe. And then the argument becomes whether you can actually lead the Muslim community. And leading the Muslim community becomes a very physical thing, in a way that you have to lead the pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina, the yearly pilgrimage called the Hajj. You have to sort of lead that. But all of these are up in the air. They're not certainly set in stone. You don't have to control Mecca and Medina. You don't have to lead the Hajj yourself. And most caliphs did not lead the Hajj themselves. And the Abbasids for a long time actually didn't control Mecca and Medina. And so all of these criterias, and then we come to the Ottomans, who eventually weren't even not only were not from the Prophet's house, they were not from the Quraysh, and they were not even Arabs, they were Turks. So we come
just inherited from the Mamluks, of course.
Yeah, we come into this sort of position where there are no rules to the caliphate. It basically becomes, it's like that line from Game of Thrones: power exists where people believe power exists. So ultimately, it becomes that. It becomes about a justification that you have to Islam's leadership, rather than any blood ties or any physical manifestations of that power. During we have two early wars, civil wars, that also settle in what the caliph means. First, we have the first civil war from 655 to 661 between Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, and the Umayyads under the leadership of Muawiyah. Ali represented a very different leadership than Muawiyah did. Ali was a secular leader and a spiritual leader to his followers, whereas Muawiyah was simply a secular leader, and then he wasn't even a leader, he was more a mediator. Ultimately, he was more trying to make peace among the tribes rather than trying to tell them what to do. But the second civil war, from around 683 to 692, is more important because it saw two members of the Quraysh battling against each other for the caliphate. On the one side, we have Abdullah ibn Zubair, who is he's a companion of the Prophet. He is related to the Prophet through marriage twice. He is the nephew of the Prophet's wife Aisha, and his father is the nephew of the Prophet's first wife Khadija. So he is linked pretty well to the Prophet. He has access to the Prophet's household, Abdullah as child. And he's a scholar of Islam as well. And on the other hand, you have Abdul Malik, whose only claim to power is the fact that he is an Umayyad, just like the Umayyads before him. But Abdul Malik is not a companion of the Prophet, and people don't like the Umayyads. People don't like the Umayyads because the Umayyads were late converts to Islam. So there was also another argument in the midst that if you are a late convert to Islam, you don't have the same claim to the caliphate as people who were early converts to Islam. So that's another criteria that sort of comes into the mix. Like I said, the criteria is sort of very malleable and changes from time to time. And in the middle of all that, there's also the fact that Abdullah controls the city of Makkah. And if you want to be the caliph, then people need to see you being the caliph. So Abdullah himself personally leads the Hajj pilgrimage for the years that he controls Makkah, while Abdul Malik is in Damascus. He cannot lead a pilgrimage, but he does send a caravan every year under the leadership of his people to sort of go and do their thing. But ultimately, all of these things, like at the moment, everything is in the favor of Abdullah ibn Zubair, except military power. Abdul Malik has the military power, and he defeats Abdullah ibn Zubair, and he becomes caliph. So all these criterias that existed, all these great justifications and stuff, all of it fails to what CGP Grey calls bigger army diplomacy. Abdul Malik had the bigger army, so he won, and he becomes the caliph. Did you want to say something?
Well, it was interesting to me. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the Abbasids, if you don't mind, because for they would be kind of the head of Sunni Islam for quite a few centuries. So what made them, even though they were, like you said, they weren't interested in imposing Islamic law or on other people until Amum, but they were like I said, kind of more science nerds, to put it that way. So what made the Abbasids, and we will discuss the three caliphates later, of course. Even when there were three caliphates, even when the Abbasids were kind of failing in power, they would still look up to the Abbasids. What made them this powerful force in the Sunni Caliph world, that they were the beacon, for not better words, of Sunni Islam?
Yeah, so once the Abbasids come to power and Al-Ma'mun's experiment of trying to impose a religious authority fails, then the caliph becomes the secular leadership of the Islamic world, especially Sunni Islam. There's no religious element to it anymore. It's just that this is a man who is sort of the leader of the community, and we should listen to him. When the Prophet passed away, the secular leader was the Caliph, and that was the only reason for you to rule in the Islamic world. You are ruling on behalf of the Prophet. You are literally his deputy. Khalifa means deputy.
Well, was this accepted among the people at the time, that the Caliph was the ultimate power?
Well, yeah. The right to rule existed with the Caliph. So everybody else was sort of subservient to the caliph in the Islamic world. Other people had titles like emir, which is a lower title. Then there's no title like emperor or anything like that. Emir is by practice sort of below the caliph. They have to listen to the caliph, even though they didn't actually listen to the caliph. The idea was that you are invested your power by the caliph. And then we get the title.
We have Sultan later.
Yeah, we have Sultan, who is the protector of the caliph. So what usually happened when you became a king or an emir was that you reached out to the caliph, and the caliph invested his authority in you, that on behalf of God, he is giving you the authority to rule. I mean, in practice, it was just I have one, please give me a robe. He'll send you a robe, and that's fine. That's done. But that was usually sort of the spiritual aspect of the soul was important as well. When the
Kind
secular
of how
authority,
it was kind of how modern corporate get away with giving you a fancy title that doesn't
yeah,
really mean much. You just feel like you're doing something more important than what you really
yeah,
are.
yeah, very much so. It was kind of like that. The Caliph was indeed a figurehead of the Islamic world. And then the Abbasid Caliphate declines in 860s and 70s, and they lose a lot of their land. But even at this point, the Caliph is seen as a high figure, so high that he holds Islam together. This was sort of the general idea that Islam is held together by the Caliph. And even when the caliphs are turned into puppets in 950 by the Buid dynasty, the Buids become the imperial authority, sure, but even they acknowledge, even though the Buids are actually Shias, they acknowledge the authority of the Sunni caliph. And there's like all these stories. There are actually eyewitness accounts of the caliph. His feet were kissed by the Buid emirs, even though the Buid emirs were technically the the power behind the whole thing. They were still in a show of authority. They were kissing the feet of the caliph, even though the caliph was just a puppet. And so there was certainly this idea that the caliph is the beacon of the Islamic world, and this idea continued throughout. We'll come to the Shia Caliphate and the other caliphates, but first let's finish talking about the
Yeah.
Abbasids. And this idea continues throughout the Buid period and then the Seljuk period. Both of these periods when the Sultan is essentially when the caliph is basically a puppet of first the Buids and then the Seljuks. And then the caliph becomes independent as the Seljuks decline, and then we get the Mongol invasions, and then the Mongols destroy Baghdad. They sack Baghdad in 1258. Now, that was a very big event for the Islamic world. That was a huge thing for the Islamic world. Because not only was this very important city, it was kind of like the New York of the Islamic world, or Constantinople of the Islamic world. Not only is this great city being
But
sacked by the
it was
Mongols.
more like Constantinople in 1453 than, say, New York at that point in time, right?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it had declined quite a bit, but it was still this sort of beacon of the Islamic world. It was sort of the heart of Islamic world, and even physically, because it was sort of in the middle of the Islamic world, you had to go cross it quite often, go through Iraq, to go in quite a few directions. So that's why it was this physical manifestation of Islam itself. And the caliph and the Abbasid Caliphate is destroyed. The caliph is executed, and Baghdad is sacked. And then a member of the Abbasid, actually the Mongols, at this point, the Mongols start a mission to hunt down all members of the Abbasid family, because the Mongols understood that the caliph has a lot of power, that the caliph can still rally people and create rebellions among the Mongols. And it wasn't helped by the fact that by this point the Mongols were recruiting Muslim soldiers. There were Muslims in the Mongol army. And so to them it was the idea was that if there's a caliph and he calls upon the caliph, then if there's a caliph and he calls upon the Muslims to defend him or to fight for him, then they might go and rebel.
Kind of like calling on a crusade in a way.
Yes, something like that. I mean, I think the idea was exaggerated, but we'll come to that in the modern era as Germany sort of enters the equation. But yeah, so one of them, actually two of the members of the Caliph, Caliph's family, the Abbasids, they escaped first to the Bedouin tribes of Syria, and then they arrive in Cairo, where the Mamluks have sort of taken over in 1250. Now, the Mamluks defeat the Mongols in 1260 at Ain Jalut. And at this point, the Mamluks are seen as the saviors of Islam. first, they have defeated the Mongols, and second, they have given shelter to the Abbasid Caliph. So that's another way of how one becomes caliph. Like, the Mamluks weren't caliphs themselves, but the idea that they had some amount of caliphal authority existed because they were protectors of Islam and they were the new home of the caliphate. And the Mamluk Sultan, he actually sends the caliph with an army to take Baghdad from the Mongols. This happens in 1262, I think. And the caliph takes his army and he goes there, and he's able to win some victories in Iraq. He just enters villages and cities, and the people just accept him and they welcome him. And so the Mongols become a little bit scared. They call their army back and they reorganize it. They're afraid that we have Muslims in our army, and if we tell them to fight their caliph, they're not going to work with us. There's going to be mutiny, and nobody knows what's going to happen. So they sort of avoid engaging the caliph until they're able to reorganize their army, and they put the Mongol soldiers up ahead and pull the Muslims back from engaging the caliph. And they engage the caliph, and the caliph is defeated and he dies, and then another member of the dynasty goes to Cairo and becomes caliph there. And despite all of that, the Mongols convert to Islam. They become Muslim, and very soon after, actually, they become Muslim. But there's no need or no call for a revival of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. And one of the biggest reasons behind that was Cairo didn't want to let them go. But the Mongols themselves didn't want to do that, because Mongol authority didn't come from God, it came from Genghis Khan. To be a king of the Mongol people in the Mongol style, you had to be a descendant of Genghis Khan. You didn't have to be a Muslim or any other kind of authority.
The rulers of the Ilkhanate kind of descendants from Genghis Khan, though?
Yeah, they were descendants of Genghis Khan, so they didn't need a caliph to instill authority in them, because, well, there was Genghis Khan to instill authority in them. So,
but why didn't they take the title Caliph themselves, as they, both descendants from Genghis Khan and recently converted Muslims? That could have given them a tremendous amount of power, I imagine.
They couldn't take the title of the Caliph. They couldn't take the title of the Caliph because, first of all, there was a Caliph already in the Abbasid world, and second, at this point, there was this idea that only members of the Quraysh tribe can become caliphs. You cannot have caliphs who, despite that, the Mongols were
also. We had that we've discussed soon. I'm sure that we have 3 different caliphates in Cordoba, in Cairo, and Abbasid at the same time. So, like you said earlier, it's kind of a loose title at this point, right? So, I mean, they could have just, with the Mongols being recently converted to Islam, they could have just taken the title for themselves.
No, they couldn't have taken the title for themselves. And the reason behind that is that when you come to the era of the 3 caliphs, let's go back to the year 909. Yeah. So we're talking about 1260s and 1270s, and let's return to 909. As the Abbasid Caliphate declines in 860s and 870s, there's new demand for leadership. And at this point, the Shias rise up and they form their own caliphate in Tunisia. In 909, the Fatimid Caliphate. The Shias have never accepted the caliphate of anyone other than Ali. They don't believe in the Abbasids being legitimate because, like I said, the Shias believe that to be caliph, you have to be a descendant of the Prophet through Ali. And so the Abbasids
makes sense in a way, right?
It does, but it also doesn't. It doesn't in the way that I'm Sunni, so I have a different perspective on this, but I do believe that family ties were something that Islam was very much against. So to have this rule where only the members of a certain family can descend, I think can ascend to the throne, I think makes it much more pre-Islamic than Islamic, because
I
Islam was
kind of see
supposed
the
to
problem with
supersede.
I kind of see the problem with having just family ties in in the Ottoman Empire when that they come to the power. That we kind of see the
Yeah,
problem there with having just one family rule the entire empire.
yeah. So certainly the idea that Islam should be ruled by one family is something that was among the Shias very very common, but the Sunnis didn't necessarily believe that. And then we have the Abbasid Caliphate and the Fatimid Caliphate. The Fatimids are Shias. So in Cordoba, in Muslim Spain, there's a guy called Abdurrahman III. He is a descendant of the Umayyads who ruled in Damascus. He's a descendant of Abdul Malik. Yeah, he's a descendant of Abdul Malik, yes, actually. And so he claims his caliphate in 929. In 929, he claims himself to be caliph because he makes the argument that he is a descendant of the Umayyads. The Abbasid caliph has become weak, and there's a Shia caliphate now. So the title of the caliph is sort of just up in the air, that anybody can now take it as long as you are a member of the Quraysh tribe. So all three of these were members of the Quraysh tribe. Two of them were from the house of the Prophet. The Umayyads were not from the house of the Prophet, but they were still members of the Quraysh tribe, and they had an older connection to the Islamic world. You see, all three of these families had a direct connection to the Prophet. The Mongols did not have a direct connection to the Prophet. So that's why
Mm.
they could not claim the caliphate for themselves.
Mm.
Um, and the Mongols weren't even interested in doing that, because their authority came from Genghis Khan, and they didn't need a second source of authority. They didn't even they don't even seem very much interested in getting the caliph in Baghdad and sort of controlling him in the way that the Mamluks were doing in 1260 and on from that. So that's sort of how the caliph worked at that time. Under the Mamluks, the caliph became something of a figurehead. Basically, he was brought out when, I'm going to war, please come and bless it, or I have taken over the throne from the previous king, a sultan, come and bless me. And the caliph would just be like, all right, fine, I'll come bless you. Like that's his only job. His only job is to legitimize the sultan. And what's interesting at this point is that everybody understand that this was business. So there were cases where the caliph would support Sultan A, and Sultan B would take over, and then he would be like, "Oh, support me," and the caliph would be like, "Okay, sure, I support you," and then Caliph A would come back, and he wouldn't punish the caliph. Usually, they would punish
Even
everybody
Sultan,
who, yeah, the Sultan would not punish the caliph, even though usually you punish everybody who betrayed you. But in this case, they understood that the caliph is sort of powerless. He's just there to appease the religious folk, and so it's fine. It's business. He's gonna do that fine. But at this point, the caliph did have, for example, charity programs going through much of the Islamic world. So the Islamic world sort of looked up to the caliph, that he was a nice person. He was helping Muslims, kind of like the Aga Khans are today. The Aga Khans have charity programs throughout the world, and they have museums and stuff like that. So they've got this whole thing going on, and in the same way, the Sunni caliph, had that back in the day. But ultimately, the Mamluks' imperial authority declined, and the Ottomans came around. And in 1516, the Ottoman Sultan Selim Yavuz conquers Cairo and the rest of Egypt. And at this point, he takes the title of the caliph for himself.
Now here's what, like we said earlier, where it becomes interesting, because like you said, the Mongols shouldn't take the title because they don't have any claim to the Prophet's family line, or but neither does the Ottomans.
Yes.
So where does I mean, obviously, like you said, they kind of inherited the title when they defeated the Mamluk Empire. But why would they have the right, considering they are just Turks, just Turks in Jews' eyes?
Yeah.
Because they are Turks and have no connection to the Prophet. So why were they allowed to take the title?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. So the Mongols were outsiders, The Mongols
It's
had just
over. It's
destroyed.
over the Ottomans,
Yeah,
though,
yeah.
weren't they?
Sorry, let me finish. The Mongols were outsiders. They had just destroyed much of the Islamic world, and they venerated Genghis Khan. They didn't venerate somebody who was local to the Islamic world. So there was this air that they were outsiders, despite the fact that they converted to Islam. Now compare that to the Ottomans.
Yeah.
The Ottomans were very clearly Muslim. They venerated Muslim Sufis. They venerated Muslim saints. And of course, they venerated the Prophet. They had an older connection to the Islamic world, to the Seljuks. The Seljuks themselves saw themselves as the protectors of the Caliph because they were the puppet masters of the Caliph. On top of that, the Ottomans had great display of power. They were seen as this militant force that was fighting against the enemies of Islam. By 1516, the Ottomans were already quite far into Europe. They had taken Constantinople. They were fighting crusades against the Christians. And to the east, they were fighting the Shia Safavid Empire. So all of these things made them very legitimate Muslims in the eyes of most Muslims. And most importantly, they had not destroyed the Islamic world the way that the Mongols had, right? And so there was this sort of idea that the Ottomans were the leaders of the Islamic world at this point. And then the Abbasid Caliph willingly, of course he doesn't willingly do it, but
Make you an offer you can't refuse.
Yeah, he gives his authority to Salim. And despite that, the Ottomans are actually a little shy about the fact that they're caliphs now. We don't see mentions of the caliphate until the 1700s. So for 200 years, the Ottomans don't use the title of the Khalifa. Or at least it's not their main title. They use these titles of even Kaisar-e-Rum, the Caesar of Rome. They use titles like these. But they're a little shy about the fact that they're the Khalifas.
Interesting that Suleiman the Magnificent didn't take the title of Caliph, considering all the other titles that he gave himself.
He had like a page full of titles, right? And actually, Khalifa was on that page of titles, but it wasn't like the displayed title. It wasn't the main title that they like to flaunt. The custodian of the two mosques is another title of Muslim caliphs, and they flaunted that because they controlled the mosque of Makkah and Medina, but they didn't flaunt the title of the caliph because they realized that their claim to the caliphate was not strong enough, and it might rattle some cages. People might not like it. Despite the fact that they had all this legitimacy as being the protectors of Islam, as being the expanders of Islam, as being the ones who had conquered Constantinople, despite that, they don't flaunt it. Until we come to the 18th centuries, the 1700s. In the 1700s, the Islamic world is starting to be rattled. I often put the date of Muslim decline around 1700, around the year 1700.
Yeah.
You have the Ottomans lose the siege of Vienna in 1683, and their power begins declining for about a century. They don't realize that their power has been just taken away from them, but their power has gone away after 1683. It sort of starts declining. In Mughal India, Aurangzeb passes away in 1707, 1705. I'm not sure. I don't remember. I always confuse these two dates, 1707 or 1705. Aurangzeb dies. And in 1730s, the Safavid Empire in Iran dies as well. So you have this entire region from what is today Bangladesh to what is today around Tunisia. You have this entire region of the Muslim world. This is the core of the Muslim world that is weak now, that is shaken up, that the leadership on this whole thing is weak. The Westerners are coming in. The Russians are battering the Ottomans. The British and the French are fighting in India and
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, the whole thing happens with Afghanistan as well. And so at this time, the Ottomans revived the title of the Caliph, hoping that it would give them some authority. It would give
And
them some power.
yeah, and I would also like to address that at this point it's kind of in the in my if I remember this correctly, in a long time the Caliph actually do rule Mecca and Medina
Yeah,
for which hasn't happened in quite a while since
yeah.
the title of Caliph, and we had the three
Makkah,
caliphates. Yeah,
yeah, Makkah is taken over by Salim in 1516, and it stays in Ottoman hands till the end of the First World War. So almost 400 years, actually, almost exactly 400
that's
years, because
impressive.
yeah, almost exactly 400 years or so. So the city of Makkah and Medina, they have all this spiritual authority, all this imperial authority, and so they revive the title of the Caliph in an attempt to bring Muslims together, in an attempt to sort of, because they see that there's a decline happening in the Islamic world, that the Europeans are coming in and there's this whole thing happening, and they try to lift themselves up as the leaders of the Muslim world. And much of the Muslim world actually sees them as the leaders, because times are tough, and the Ottomans have imperial aura. They have the city of Constantinople. They control the cities of Makkah and Medina, and all these things. And because of all that, people are willing to look away from the fact that they're not Arabs and that they're not the members of the Quraysh. By this time, that has sort of gone away, and now it's fine, as long as they can guide us. And the people do think that they are guiding us at this point. Um, and so this sort of continues, even though it doesn't mean much. It doesn't resort to much. The Ottomans are unable to get help from other Muslim empires. They do, the title of the Caliph does allow them more control over their military, but then there's the whole thing about the Janissaries. The Janissaries that are out of their control, their army is not modern enough, so they start losing battle after battle. Russia takes away so much of their land, and Europeans encroach in Eastern Europe, and so eventually, they start losing territory. And then
And
we
you have
come,
also in the 19th century, you have, Muhammad Ali in Egypt as well.
yeah, you have Muhammad Ali in 1798, about 100 years, more than a little bit over 100 years after the failed siege of Vienna. Napoleon enters Egypt,
Yeah.
and he's able to take Egypt with incredible ease. With a lot of ease, he's able to take Egypt. And at this point, the Muslims sort of wake up that there has been a decline going on for about a century that they didn't know about, that they didn't realize. And so, of course, the British help them, and Muhammad Ali comes in and he takes over. And then Muhammad Ali himself starts to rebel against them. He takes over Syria, he takes over Egypt. And of course, in Arabia, we have the first Saudi state. These are these local tribes that are revolting against the Caliph. And so there are all these things happening, and the Ottoman Empire is declining. And in the midst of all that, and this is something very interesting, Otto von Bismarck is able to unite the Germans, and he turns the King of Prussia into the German Emperor.
If I may interrupt you again, I want to talk about before we go into Germany role in this. What with everything that's going on in the Middle East, like you said, decline with the rise of the Saudis, and Muhammad Ali in Egypt. With the title, what does the title of Caliph mean at this point? Like, do people still care about the title of Caliph, or is it more like, eh, it's just a thing that they, let them have this title, or
Yeah,
what about, the thing in Egypt, because I'm not sure it was easier when it was under Ottoman control, right, to have the title and legitimize the title of Caliph. But how legitimized were the title of Caliph with the rise of the Saudis, and you have, Muhammad Ali in Egypt and other Europe, in I wouldn't say decline, but so from the Ottomans losing the title in Europe, what does the title of Caliph actually mean at this point from the Ottomans?
the title of the Caliph still means something. For example, Muhammad Ali never declares himself to be an independent ruler, even though he goes to war against the Ottoman Caliph. he doesn't declare himself to be an independent ruler because he actually doesn't have the authority to rule in Egypt. He's not Egyptian, he's Albanian, and he rules under the banner of the Ottomans. There's no way that he can bring Egypt together without foreign help, and that help includes the Ottomans and the British. So it still means something to all these people. But then you have the Saudis. The Saudis have another problem. The Saudis don't like the Turks. The Arabs believe themselves to be the real heirs of Islam, and so we do come to this after during the First World War. But the Arabs at this point feel like the Ottomans are not the true heirs of the Prophet, and so we need to build our own state. We need to bring religious authority back to ourselves. And the Saudis are sort of an attempt at that. The Saudis have united behind a religious leader named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab.
Go back to the Arab Golden Age, to put it that way.
Yes, they want to go back to that era. So they unite behind Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. And Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab's authority reigns supreme for the Saudis over the authority of the Caliph. Because Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab is not only a Muslim, but an Arab Muslim, but also he's a reformer. He talks about how society has become corrupt, how all these bad things are happening because Muslims have lost their way, they are far from God, and so we must do something to return Islam to its true roots. And so his authority sort of becomes dominant in the Saudis. The Saudis are eventually defeated, but they come back and stuff like that, and so forth. But the authority of the Caliph. Sorry?
You broke up a little bit, but yeah, go on.
Okay. The authority of the Caliph at this point still is very important, for example, to the Indians and to the Indonesians and all these disparate Muslims. The Indonesians actually asked for help from Suleiman. They asked Suleiman for help back in the day when the British came around in the 1540s, I believe, 1530s, 1540s. They had asked the Caliph for help, and Suleiman had even helped some ships. So the authority of the Caliph does have some meaning to Muslims, especially to non-Arab Muslims. The Persians at this point are Shia, so they don't really care. And the Arabs have problems with the Caliph, and so they don't care that much either, but everybody else cares. The Muslims of India care, the Muslims of Africa care, the Muslims of Central Asia care, the Muslims of Indonesia care. So all these Muslims do have something about the Caliph.
Is the Friday prayer still in the, even maybe not just in Indonesia and India, but also in Egypt and in Saudi? Is the Friday prayer still said in the Caliph's name?
Actually no, because after the Ottomans took over Egypt and they took over the Caliphate, that the tradition of saying the Caliph's name in Friday prayer sort of declines. So it's usually the name of the Sultan that is said in the prayer, because the Ottomans are not, they're not flaunting the fact that they're caliphs. So others are not really also true believers in that fact. So at this point, the authority of the Caliph does decline, because for 200 or so years, there is no visible Caliph, even though the Ottomans are caliphs and whatever, but there's no visible Caliph. So the visibility of the Caliph sort of dies out. And that very much has to do with the fact that the Islamic world was at its peak at this point. The Islamic world was very rich, very powerful. All three empires, the gunpowder empires, were winning battles. Everything was going great. And so there was no real need for a caliph. There was no real need for a leader of the community. It's only the bad times when you need a leader, right? And so in 1700s, when the bad times arrive,
certainly a country right now that I can think of that you need a leader.
Of course, obviously, there's no, yeah.
I can't help myself.
Yeah, so that sort of changes at this point. In 1700s, the Caliph comes back, and now everybody looks to the Caliph. The Indian Muslims very much look to the Caliph. The others around the Islamic world look to the Caliph. and that includes the Germans.
Yeah.
So in the year
Sorry for derailing, but I
1900,
just felt like that question was kind of important to ask. What the
Mhm.
world thought of the Caliph before we went
No,
into
yeah,
Germany. Yeah.
yeah. So in the year 1900, the country with the largest number of Muslims would be the British Empire. They controlled so much of the world. They controlled India, they controlled parts of Africa, they controlled parts of the Middle East, and so the British at this point were the rulers of the largest population of Muslims.
Mm.
And Germany had just united under Otto von Bismarck and the Kaiser Wilhelm. And they were sort of late to the party of colonization and imperial, this sort of imperial scramble that Europe was in the middle of. And they wanted a way that they could easily destroy the British, or at least get an upper hand on the British. And their solution to that is the Muslims. They think that if they can prop up the Caliph, then they can unite the Muslims behind the Caliph, and then the Caliph would say, fight against the British, and the Muslims would fight against the British. And to this end, the Kaiser Wilhelm II does a lot. He goes on a visit to the Middle East. He does a speech in Jerusalem. He pays to rebuild the tomb of Salahuddin Ayyubi, Saladin, the Crusades, the hero from the Muslim side of the Crusades. And he sponsors a train line that ultimately would go from Hamburg in Germany through Berlin to Istanbul, then to Damascus, and then to Mecca and Medina, and
There
also
is a book
Baghdad.
about this, I think, that came
Yeah,
out a
the
while ago.
Berlin-Baghdad
Yeah.
Express. Yeah. And so this is an attempt for the Germans to sponsor the strengthening of the Caliph's authority. This would also help the Caliph move his troops much easier, from Syria to Mecca and Medina and Baghdad, and so all these things. Plus, it would help trade, help facilitate trade. So it was a good thing for everybody. And the Germans were betting big on this. They were friends with the Ottomans. They were friends with the Austro-Hungarians, of course, and they were trying to build more of a legitimacy around the Caliph among the Muslims by showing that the Caliph was strong and that we were standing behind him. However, that all fails during the First World War. During the First World War, the Ottomans and the Germans are fighting on the same side, and the Caliph calls for Muslims to support him.
Try to do a jihad.
But the jihad fails.
Why does it fail?
Why does it fail? That's a good question. Because local interests are much more powerful. For the Muslims of India, for example, a lot of them are now serving the British Army. They know the British, and they're simply business. They're working for the British, and so they come. A lot of Indians, of course, join the war, and they come to places like France where they fight Germany and stuff like that. So they're fighting on the opposite side of the British Empire. Of the Ottoman Empire. And then Indian troops, for example, help take Palestine as well. The British take Palestine with the help of Indian troops. So everybody has local interests in mind. What you would have needed is you would have needed local leaderships that would have rallied their men. Let's say there's a leader in some part of India, and then there's another leader, and then there's another leader, and all these guys come together. But this was simply impossible.
And
This was
if I
impossible.
may ask another question, why didn't the Indian sepoys or soldiers revolt in the British Army to a jihad, considering they were treated rather poorly by the British as well? I mean, we have the, of course, famous 1857 revolt, where they do revolt against the British, but why didn't they do this? Because, like we said, the Indians, under the Mughals, they look very much, like you stated, towards the Ottoman Empire as a caliphate. So why didn't they this time around versus back then?
They didn't revolt because there was a lack of leadership. The British had organized their army in such a way after 1857 that the soldiers could not unionize in the way that they had in 1857. They couldn't come together in the same way
Do
that
you
they
think that
had
if
in
it
1857.
was easier to unionize, that it could possibly have been a kind of jihad in a way? Or do you think that was unrealistic in any case?
I think that would be unrealistic in that way because there was no leadership throughout India of the Muslims. There was no large leadership of I mean, in 1857, when the soldiers had gathered, they still looked to leaders, and these leaders were the Rajas and eventually the Mughal emperor, right? There was a leader, and they needed to strengthen him. But in this case, there was no leadership. The the Caliph said, fight the British. Sure, how do we do that? We are on their payroll. We are literally being fed by them. And we don't have any weapons. We don't have any leaders. We don't have anything to do this with. So the military, the people, they just did what they did. And the British were also good at keeping people in line. And so there was no large crystallization of the military into a sort of pan-Islamic army. It was also the fact that the Indians themselves didn't like each other. So Muslims from one part of India did not want to work with Muslims from another part of India. There were problems, there were there were nationalistic tensions, there was stuff like that. So there was no large effort to protect
What
the
about the
Caliph.
other Muslims other than Indian soldiers?
The Persians were Shias, so they didn't really care. And the Arabs, now we're coming to the Arabs. The Arabs during the First World War were part of the problem for the Ottoman Empire. They revolted. The British went to them and the British told them, well, you're the descendants of the Prophet. You have more of a claim to the Caliphate than these Turks do. So the Arabs revolted. Egypt was already under the control of the British, so it was certainly not going to revolt. Much of the Islamic world was under the control of various allied powers. France, for example, was one. And so there was no sort of effort to come together and fight like that. Because the Muslim
But
world
didn't they
was so
look at their
divided.
oppressors as infidels, though?
They did, sure, they did, but they didn't have the kind of leadership, they didn't have the kind of education, the kind of skills that were needed to prop up a large resistance. They simply did not. I mean, that's the whole thing about the colonial era, right? Everybody
Yeah.
saw the Europeans as oppressors, but nobody was able to levy any kind of real resistance, a strong resistance against them because of how strong the European machinery
And
was.
this must be a little derailing, but the only real successful revolt against a colonial power would be the Saint-Domingue uprising in
Yeah,
the 18th century. That's the only real successful revolt
yeah,
against
yeah,
colonial
definitely.
power.
Definitely, and it was the whole thing about the. I mean, this plays into the larger colonial story, right? It was not just the Muslims didn't unite; it was that nobody was able to prop up proper revolutions against the colonial overlords because of how things were organized. Because Europe was just so dominant because of the Industrial Revolution, because of all these different things, nobody was able to prop up any kind of proper resistance.
And just the closest you have is the Boer War or the Zulu War in under the British Empire, but that's
Yeah,
about it that I can think of. I mean,
yeah,
there
of
were
course.
revolts, sure, like Tipu's son, but and that's not a part of this episode, I know. But there were revolts, sure,
Hmm.
but none of them were really successful in that matter.
Yeah, and by the time the First World War came around, the Westerners, the Europeans had their fingers everywhere. You know, like Zanzibar, for example. Zanzibar and
Yeah,
Oman was an empire. Actually, at this point, they were separate, but they were controlling all these different small territories of the Islamic world. And you know, let's assume let's put a scenario that there's a leader in the Indian subcontinent, a Muslim leader, and he gathers 10,000 men. And now he wants to help the caliphate. What's he gonna do? He can revolt in India, but he's got 10,000 men and he'd be mowed down quite easily. If he wants to go to Turkey to help the caliphate there, he's gonna need a ship, and that ship is gonna need to cross from the Suez Canal.
Yeah.
That ship is gonna need to cross the entry into the Red Sea, and the British controlled both sides of that. They controlled the port of Aden in Yemen, and they controlled the Suez Canal. How exactly the logistics of it, all of it was just impossible. That's sort of the brilliance of colonial era, that they controlled so many important things. I mean, even today, Britain controls the Strait of Gibraltar because it gave them an access point on the Mediterranean. And so all these things, they sort of come together into a disaster for the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire falls apart, and then we have, of course, the whole dividing of the Middle East, and the title of the Caliph just goes away. The title of the Caliph is eventually dissolved by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in
Let's talk a little
1923.
before we go there. Let's talk a little bit more in detail about because it's also quite a fascinating part of this. Let's talk about a little more about the enthronement of the Caliph and how the end of the Caliphate came about.
So, of course, the end of the Caliphate came about because the Caliph had lost all authority. And Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was making a push for westernization and secularization.
And again, he kind of loses authority in 1908 under the Young Turk Revolution.
Yeah.
That's where he kind of loses, become just a constitutional monarch.
Yeah. He loses his I mean, a secular authority, sure, but he also loses his spiritual authority. And I'm talking about spiritual authority in that nobody really cared about the Caliph anymore. We had seen in the First World War that the Caliph had utterly failed to unionize any kind of large effort from the Muslims to defend him, for the Muslims to come together. So he is essentially just a figurehead. And the rest of the Islamic world sees him as such. And so there's no real need for him anymore. And so in a push to westernize, Ataturk dissolves the caliphate, and the caliph is exiled to France. And at this point, there's a movement called the Khilafat movement in India, where people are protesting and they're gathering money to lobby the British government to establish the caliphate again.
Wow.
So it tells us a little bit about what the caliph was meant to people and what the caliphate still means to people. Even in today's world, when Muslims see themselves in a state of decline, some Muslims do believe in the caliphate, in that this is a beacon of light for the rest of the Islamic world. That there's this person whose leadership is required for the rest of the Muslim world. But when he existed, it didn't happen. When he existed, his authority didn't mean much other than lip service. And in his early days, the caliph was simply somebody who legitimized people by saying, yeah, you're a sultan, you're ruling in my name. And later on, the caliph was a figurehead in kind of the same way that the Pope is. And what the caliph would have done, what would have been interesting in today's world, I think, would have been mediating treaties between Muslims and among Muslims, to be honest. Let's say that the Ottoman Caliph still existed. Would he have been able to do anything about Palestine? Probably not, because he would have his own political aims, right? He would probably be under the subservience of the state of Turkey, and what Erdogan would say he would do. And Erdogan he has his own political aims, so the whole thing sort of comes together. And it was kind of the same back in that day as well. So the caliph's religious authority existed for the first maybe 100 years or 200 years, but then the caliph's authority went away, and so the office of the caliph was dissolved by Ataturk, And now we look back at the Caliph as sort of with rosy glasses, right? Uh,
Yeah.
but the truth is that when he existed, it still didn't mean much. The Khilafat movement in India failed, well, because of a lot of internal corruption and stuff, but also because the British were never going to lobby. No matter how much money you give them, they were never going to talk to the Turks and try to restore the caliphate, right? And so that was never going to happen. That was never going to come together. And yeah, the caliphate just went away.
So why has there not been an attempt even in the 20th or the 21st? Like, I mean, you kind of already answered this question, right? But why hasn't there been an attempt even by the Saudis to own Mecca Medina? For example, why has there been no attempt of creating a new caliphate to that Muslims could possibly unify under, or kind of just why has there been no attempt in the
Mm.
20th or the 21st century to have more of a, like you said, more of a figurehead, but also something that this in the Islamic world will look up to? Why has there been no attempt to reinstate the title of caliph? I mean, there
Yeah.
are a few of unofficial caliphs that claim to be caliph, from my understanding, but they don't mean much, right? But as an official title for the Islamic, at least Sunni or Shia world, why has there been no attempt at this in looking at the state of the Islamic world today, for example, to try to unify a little bit more?
Hmm. Because there's no one who's popular enough um to just simply say I'm the caliph.
Do you think that
In
even if
to,
they were, they would accept it?
no, nobody will accept. Let's assume, I mean, today, if somebody has to claim the title of the caliph, what kind of authority, what kind of candidates do we have? We have someone from the house of the Ottomans, but
I
the
mean, the Saudis
Ottomans,
kind of are the closest because they have Mecca and
yeah,
Medina.
uh, let's come to that in a minute. The Ottomans, but the Ottomans, none of their members actually seem interested in doing anything like that, and even if they do, I don't know how well it work out. The Saudis control the city of Makkah and Medina. They are sort of the powerful Muslim country, not powerful, but the rich Muslim country, right? But the problem is that first of all, they're Wahhabis, so a lot of other Muslims don't like them because of that. Secondly, because let's say Muhammad bin Salman, people don't like him personally. Let's say he declares himself to be caliph, there will be a lot of people who will not accept it. There will be Muslims in India who would not accept it. There will be Muslims in Egypt, Syria. Pretty much nobody outside of Saudi Arabia would be happy with this. And let's say that the US, for example, supports the caliph and be like, yeah, okay, we accept Muhammad bin Salman as the caliph of the Islamic world. People are going to be against him for the mere fact that he's accepted by the US.
Yeah.
And then there's also no real need for a caliph. There's the idea of the caliph, sure, but there's nobody today who's popular enough among all Muslims to become caliph somehow, to just declare himself to be caliph. And most Muslim countries don't really need mediation, except Saudi Arabia and Iran. But if you have a Sunni caliph, Iran is never gonna listen to them. So ultimately, there's no point to having a caliph. At least like a universal figure of a caliph. I do think that local leadership is required, sure, but I don't know if there's any need for a caliph, and I think that that's the reason that nobody has tried to revive the caliphate, and also because it would be very.
Just so we're going to round up soon, of course, but I have one question I want to ask is, how do the world view the caliphate today in the 21st century, and especially among the Islamic world? How is the history of the caliphate viewed?
Among the Sunnis do believe in sort of a a rosy image of the Caliph. There
Is
are
it
those who,
romanticized?
yeah, a romanticized version of the Caliphate, of this sort of a golden era. But people forget the fact that the Caliph was also just a person, and so, whatever happened, the Caliph was responsible for good things and bad things. Today, people do think that there's a need for some kind of a unity among the Muslim world, um, so that we can do all these things. But there's also the fact that the Muslim world is divided by local interests, right? And so, how much unity the Caliph can bring is very much up in the air.
I want to ask, go back to the 60s for a minute, because and I want to ask because I know early modern Islamic history is not really your thing, but as you know, in the 60s, Nasser tried to kind of make a unified Arab world
Yeah.
and had he succeeded in this, do you think that there would have been room for a caliphate if, say, he had succeeded in his dream of a united Arab world?
It could have been interesting, actually. Like, if Nasser had succeeded in doing that, he could have invited a member. Well, the only way that he could have done it is if they had, is
You think
if
there would
he
have been
had.
room for a caliph if he had successfully made an
It could have been,
Arab?
yeah. He could have done it. He could have done it if he had succeeded in doing that. But there's complications to that. First, who would the caliph be? As an Arab, Nasser and others would not have liked to invite the Ottomans back. Would not have liked to, let's say, invite the son of the last caliph to take over the caliphate, and become sort of puppets in Egypt, kind of like the Mamluk days. But they wouldn't have done that, and in terms of Arabs, there's nobody really who's popular enough to do that. So what you would have to do, I think, is you would have to create a lot of propaganda about some kind of a descendant of the prophet that you have with you, who's guiding you and who's doing this and that and that, in order to do that. But I don't know if there's room for something like that anymore. Even through this long decline that the Islamic world has been in, there's certainly need for unity, but the problem with the unity is not that that there's nobody to unite them. Rather, it's that they don't want to unite. The local interests, the
Stubborn little
special interests,
bastards, aren't they?
yeah. The local interests, like for example, Jordan. Jordan defends Israel when Iran attacks it. And Saudi Arabia and all the, like, we have seen, with the whole Gaza thing, we have seen how disunited the Muslim world is, and even the will of the people, every Muslim people throughout the Muslim world, and I think people throughout the world, want the whole thing to be resolved, but because governments don't want it to be resolved, and that includes Islamic governments, things just don't change. And so, how much room there is for a caliph? Like, the caliph would just be a puppet. Right, and
Also, would the Western world accept a caliphate? Like, wouldn't CIA just come in and, yeah, no.
Yeah, the CIA would want someone they support, who supports them, to be the caliph, right? And
Yeah.
the Muslim world wouldn't accept him. I think ultimately the problem is that the US is interference. Like, if they stop interfering, things can, something can happen. But yeah. I just ultimately believe that the caliph is a relic of the past that we've gotten, that is gone, and that's it.
Yeah.
Today, the closest thing to a caliph, what a modern day caliph would look like, are the Aga Khans. The fifth Aga Khan just turned 55, I think, a couple of days ago, and he's a billionaire. He has interests everywhere. He has companies, and he has all these charities and whatever, and blah blah blah. And that's all that there would be. And the Aga Khans, what did they do for Gaza? Nothing really, So, what would something like this look like?
Finally, the final We are down to run up soon. I said that earlier, but we are. But I have a final question. Now, this would be an episode in itself. But are there any misconceptions about the Caliph? And I'm sure you've gone through some of them in this episode. But are there any misconceptions about the Caliphate that you think are worth mentioning?
Misconceptions about the Caliphate. I mean, people tend to compare the Caliphate with the papacy. It's not exactly like that. The Caliph never had as much religious authority as the Pope does today. Like the Pope can dictate where the Catholic dogma is going to go, right? Like they had all these councils in the 50s and 60s. They had those councils. There was one called something to. In the 20th century, they had these councils to sort of dictate the position of the church on various things. The Caliph never did that. It was the ulama who did that, and if the Caliph tried to intervene, the ulama would be very angry with that. So the Caliph is not exactly the Pope. It's a very different thing. And another thing that I sort of think about is that people assume that the Caliphate is sort of an Islamic way of doing things.
And we kind of mentioned this already, right? That you have to have Mecca, Medina to be our Caliph, and we already touched on this, of course, but that's not necessarily true, as we have talked about.
Right. The position of Makkah and Medina in the whole struggle is quite vague. Whether to be a caliph you need Makkah and Medina is kind of... I mean, in Crusader Kings, you certainly need Makkah and Medina to be caliph. But in real life, it's not that simple. There have been caliphs who didn't control Makkah and Medina. There have been people who controlled Makkah and Medina.
Empire, for example.
Yeah, and even the Mamluks, controlled Makkah and Medina, but they weren't caliphs. The Ayyubids controlled Makkah and Medina, they weren't caliphs. The Fatimids controlled Makkah and Medina, and they were caliphs, sure.
But not for the Sunnis.
Sorry?
Not for the Sunnis.
Not for the Sunnis, exactly. And so there's no real criteria to being caliph. Basically, you just have to have some kind of connection to the caliphate. Or you have to be... Yeah, you have to be Muslim, sure.
Like, but I can proclaim myself a caliph if I wanted to.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to, like, all these things, there's you have to be popular enough that everybody loves you, or everybody respects you enough that
but you're quite popular, to be fair.
No, I am not popular. Have you seen my Twitter feed? People don't like me at all, because I have a lot of controversial views. So yeah, definitely. But yeah,
I think we've done the run. Yeah. Sorry?
But yeah, that's what I'm saying, that the position of the caliph, how do you establish the caliphate, it's quite subjective, and it's quite dependent on what the time period is like. In today's world, you would need someone who everybody likes, even if they don't have a direct connection to the caliphate, but there's an unspoken rule that that person has to be an Arab, if they're not directly connected to the Ottomans. So that's that.
This might be a weird question, but are there actually any families descendant from Muhammad or the early caliphates today that could be a potential candidate for the throne?
Yeah, could be, but again, we need somebody who's more popular, somebody who is known throughout the Islamic world. If you have a figure like Pope Francis, somebody who's a religious leader, who's an Arab, but who's got this reputation, like everybody likes Pope Francis, right? So if you have that kind of an image, then that person...
You mean Pope Leo?
Pope Leo is new, so he doesn't have the same reputation. But
right.
I'm talking about like
other one.
Pope Francis, the one before him. Like he
has
this sort of he has this sort of a teddy bear kind of sort of this sort of father figure of the Catholics, and even non-Catholics and other people kind of like him because he has this sort of a generous aura, right? Somebody like him, I think, could declare himself to be Caliph, or others could declare him Caliph or something like that. But it would take time. Definitely take time.
And I think we're gonna round it up there. Thank you so much for coming back again. And of course, before you go, do you have anything you want to promote? You're working on this topic on your channel, I believe, as well.
Yeah.
So where are some can people find you on social media? Where can people find your YouTube channel? I mean, it's kind of just too brutal if you look up Albert Dima, but where can people find your channel, of course, and where are your social media that you want to share or anything else you want to share or promote? You have the timeline of Islamic history. I'm not gonna try if you're on YouTube. Sorry, it's a little messy, but if you look, I can't do this right now, but it's.
All right, let me
timeline.
me get it then.
Yeah.
I have it here, right here. This.
There you go. There you go. You have the timeline of Islamic history that you're working on. Have there, of course, and you have the map of Al-Andalusia that's been briefly mentioned in this episode as well. Where can people buy those posters? And I would absolutely recommend that you do because they are absolutely gorgeous. And even recently, you have also non-picture if you're a Muslim and listening to this and what the so you have with both the one with photos and one without photos in them for the Muslims who may want to be interested in one as well. And of course, like I mentioned, the map of Al-Andalusia and with historical events that's going on there. So where can people find all the work that you've done for if they want to buy the posters, find your YouTube channel or your social media?
Yeah, if you want to follow me, you should just go to almuqaddimah.com. You'll find links to everything there, my YouTube channel, my Instagram, TikTok, etc., etc., etc. But you can also buy the posters from there. So it's basically almuqaddimah.com is the one-stop shop for everything related to me.
And they're absolutely gorgeous, and I would recommend absolutely buying them. They're around $30, I believe, around that price.
$30, yes.
Yeah. Thank you again so much for coming on. Make sure to check out some other episodes that we've done. I think this is the 4th time that you're back. 4th or perhaps even 5th. We've done episodes on the origins of Islam. I don't remember the 2nd episode right now that you've been on, but we also done
that was with Saladin.
Yeah, that's Saladin. That's right. Yeah, we done one on Saladin. We done one on medieval Islam. This is the 4th. Yeah, it's because and most recent this episode, of course, on the Caliphate of Islam. So make sure to check out the 3 other episodes that we've done as well, and I'm sure we will. This won't be the last time we see him on the podcast. So thank you so again. It's been a great pleasure. This has been Without Aged Well. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Spotify, consider give us 5 stars or give us 1. At least on my side of the world, it's still a free country or free world for now, at least, and. Yeah, if you hate this podcast, give us 1 star. Or if you love this podcast, give us 5. If you're on YouTube, like, share, subscribe. If you're on Apple Podcasts, leave a review. That would be very nice. I love to read reviews. If you are on YouTube, leave your thoughts about the Caliphate and who do you think should be a potential Caliph in the 21st century. That would be an interesting conversation, I'm sure. And this has been Without Aged Well. We are available on social media under Instagram, Without Aged Well, and Twitter, Without Aged Well. We are also on Blue Sky, though I'm mainly on Twitter. I don't know why, but for some reason I'm still there. So we are on Without Aged Well as well. Stay tuned for the next episode. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.